This is my grandfather's guitar. This is a painting that used to hang in the house of my other grandfather. Well, not this exact one, but it's a print of a painting that used to hang in my grandfather's house. So what does my grandfather's guitar and my other grandfather's painting have to do with Genesis and Abraham and Isaac? That's a great question. Today, I want to talk to you about legacies. The legacies that we have been left, the legacies that we leave. As we're journeying through the Old Testament together, we're seeing and we're reading all of these stories that some of us are very familiar with. Some of us, we've kind of heard them before. They ring a bell. And others of us, we're reading them for the first time. But in any of those cases, one of the things that I want to help us see is that these aren't just ancient stories in an ancient book. These are our stories. They are stories that we are meant to embrace and wrestle with and step into and find ourselves in all kinds of ways. And when we do that, that's when we really start to find the wisdom that shapes us, that molds us, that helps us to grow into richer, deeper, wiser, better people. One of the stories that we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a snapshot of the story of Abraham and Isaac. And when I say snapshot, what I mean is like a wide-angle lens snapshot. We're not going to zoom in on a specific part, but we're going to step back and look at something a little broader. One of the most important things about Abraham's story is that Abraham is the person that God calls out apart from his family and his people and his religion, his faith at the time, and says, you are the person that I am going to use to make a great people and a great nation from your line, and I'm going to use that people to bring knowledge of me into the entire world. So he makes a covenant with this guy, originally Abram, eventually Abraham, and this is what he says. This is in Genesis chapter 12. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples of the earth, that's a lot of people, will be blessed through you. This is the covenant, the promise that God sets up with Abraham. Now, a lot happens in Abraham's story, but we're going to fast forward a little bit. All right, this is probably the most famous part of Abraham's story. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham is called to sacrifice his son Isaac. You may not remember, but Abram and Sarai, who became Abraham and Sarah after God changed their names, they are promised that a multitude of people will come from them, will be their descendants, that this great nation will come from them. But they haven't had any children. Lo and behold, God appears one day walking down the road and reminds them, no, you will have children, and that child, your first child, will come from Sarah. Sarah thinks this is ridiculous. She laughs at God. The child does come. He ends up being named Isaac. His name is similar in meaning and sound to the Hebrew word for laughter. Now Isaac has been born and he's growing. And again, Abraham finds himself in a testing situation where God comes and says, you need to sacrifice your son to me. Hold on. This is the promised son. What the flibbin' jibbin' are you doing? It's a test. God has promised Abraham a multitude, a great people, a nation would come from him. He's promised that it would come from him and Sarah. Isaac is finally that promise in the flesh. And God puts Abraham's faith to the test, asking that he gives that promise that's right in front of him. Will he give it back? Will he still trust God, even if it's taken away? Well, we all know how the story goes. Isaac willingly goes along with this. Abraham goes to sacrifice him, and God intervenes and stops him, and instead provides the appropriate sacrifice, the lamb that's caught in the bushes. And he renews the covenant promise with Abraham. And again, this is what he says. All of the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. because you have obeyed my command. Now, this reminder comes several other times, but one of the big things that I want you to catch in this covenant promise is that Abraham isn't just promised that something great is going to happen to him and for him, but Abraham is promised that something great is going to happen through him. That God is doing this blessing in his life for a purpose, so that he can bless everyone else. Now, we're going to fast forward again. I have no idea what that is. I guess that's fast forwarding. All right, Genesis chapter 26. Isaac is now taking up the family mantle. He's now in charge and he's taking lead. God shows up to reaffirm the promise. What does God say to him? I will be with you and I will bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and your offspring. And I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will give your offspring these lands. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. So there it is again. God is affirming this covenant, confirming the promise, passing it on to the next generation. And in that blessing is the whole idea and premise that you are going to be blessed to be a blessing. I am blessing you so that through you, others can be blessed. This has been given to Abraham. This has been given to Isaac. Isaac's in charge. Now his sons are going to come along. Let's see what happens here. Just one chapter later, in Genesis 27, we have Jacob and Esau and that whole debacle where Jacob comes in and he steals the birthright and he connives and he sneaks his way into getting the blessing from Isaac. And when Isaac passes on the blessing that was passed on to him and he gives the assurance of God's covenant promises to the next generation, this is what Isaac says. May God give to you from the dew of the sky and from the riches of the land an abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you and nations bow down and worship to you. Be master over your relatives. May your mother's sons bow and worship to you. May those who curse you be cursed and those who bless you be blessed. And then he stops. Hold up. Wait a minute. Isaac, ain't you forgetting a little something there at the end? God has showed up and affirmed for Abraham over and over again the covenant promise. It's very clear what the covenant promise is. I will bless you, and those that bless you will be blessed, and those that curse you will be cursed, and you will be multiplied, and you'll inherit a land, and a great nation will come from you, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Isaac shows up. Abraham probably spends a lifetime teaching this and passing this on to Isaac. And God himself shows up and says to Isaac, hey, here's the blessing again. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. The whole purpose of God calling these people apart is so that through this people, through this family, through this tribe, all other families, all other tribes, all other nations will be blessed. They will come to know the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Here's the problem. Isaac goes to pass on the blessing to the third generation. We're not that far removed, and he fails to pass on to his son the part of the covenant promise and blessing that through them all the nations of the earth might be blessed. So what does that have to do with my grandfather's guitar? What does that have to do with this painting? My grandfather, from what I've heard, was an excellent musician. He played all kinds of instruments. He was involved in a local radio show. He played in his church. He played for friends' weddings and barn dances. He had a wonderful reputation in the community, in the area. People loved him. Music was a huge part of his life. How he served people, how he served God, how he connected with others. Here I am, 38 years old, and that is a legacy that has been passed on to me. I play guitar, I play piano, I played trumpets, I play bass, I sing. I serve in church that way. I've been in orchestras and bands. I've played in the community. I've traveled. I've connected with people through music. I've served and encouraged others through music. There was this legacy that was passed on to me through my family, something that I kind of inherited. This painting, it was etched into my mind. I remember being in my grandfather's house, and I remember his Bible, and I remember my grandmother, and I remember her Bible, and that it was always on the little table next to her chair, and how tattered it was because she read it all the time. And I remember the stories that my dad would tell me about how he was a man of prayer, and that he would build an altar in his closet in the house because he wanted an altar of prayer in the closet in his house because he had read that in scripture, and he wanted to be a man of prayer, and he didn't want to be a man of prayer out in public places but in private places, the way that Christ taught. And I remember this painting hanging in his house and the impact that it's had on me, and how even to this day I want to be a student of the Word, and I want to be a man of prayer, and I want to be a guy that leads my family in humility and faithfulness. There's this legacy that's been passed on. And so when we look at Genesis, and we look at the story of Abraham, and we look at the story of Isaac, we're challenged to remember a couple of things. The first is we have to remember that we are blessed to be a blessing. I know it's something we've all heard before, probably to the point where we are deaf to it, but we need to open our ears up and hear it again. You are blessed to bless others. God works good in your life so that you can work good in the lives of others. And we have to be intentional to cultivate that and continue that. Which brings me to the second point, which is really more of a question, something for us to think about. What kind of legacy are you leaving? Are you telling the next generation the whole story? Are you giving them the full message of who God is and who we are and who we are supposed to be and what we are supposed to be doing in the kingdom of God by His grace and by His power? Or are we just telling them parts of the story? We can tell people all about peace and joy and forgiveness and new beginnings. But if we don't tell them about faithfulness and being servants and taking up our crosses and going into the world to be ambassadors of reconciliation, people who intentionally live out and proclaim the gospel in word and deed, if we're not giving them the whole story, the idea that Christ saves us and makes us new so that we can go out and do good in the world in His name and bring that salvation message to others, we're only giving them part of the story. So what kind of legacy will you leave? You have been blessed to be a blessing. Are you intentionally going out to bless others? Don't live half the story. Don't pass on half the story. Live the full story and pass on the full story, because the stories that we read, they're our stories. So let's live them well. Grace and peace. Very good, very good.